We've now got the great pleasure to introduce our next guest. A very, very warm welcome to Ranjit Hoskote.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Yeah. Hello. Very nice to see you. Yeah. Yeah. Now, Ranjit, to begin with the beginning, it's difficult to ask you how it all started with literature, because then you're also an art critic. It's difficult to ask you how it is with art criticism, because you're also a curator. So maybe to begin with the beginning, I wanted to ask you about your various multiple identities. Interpreter, double agent, spy. Can you tell us about your many identities?
I think the idea of is this working?
No, it isn't.
Like this? I think that sense of being a double agent has been very, very strong, because there was a sort of simultaneous beginning to my activity as a poet, as someone who wrote on art, and who then translated some of these arguments into curatorial form. But in each field, of course, you're seen a bit as being on the other side. So it was in the context of bringing all of these together that I developed that notion of being always in a state of interpreting one side of myself to the other, and of being a translator somehow in each discipline.
Now, Felix Gonzalez Torres always told me the same thing. He said, I want to be a double agent, I want to be a spy. It was about infiltration. Is he important for you?
I think it's actually, there was this tremendous survey of his work that we saw quite recently, which certainly reminded me of the importance of the sense of being able to infiltrate institutional spaces and to leave relics, symptoms, traces behind. So a lot of what I do as a poet has to do with burying clues and symptoms and traces into more classical forms. And as a critic, I suspect it is the opposite, which where I try and infiltrate the world and the life world and the imagination of a fellow creative person, and try and draw out all that is elusive and hidden.
Now, we spoke a lot about your curating and your art criticism when we met first, and I wasn't really aware of your whole literary oeuvre at that point, which was about 3 or 4 years ago when we met for the first time in Mumbai. And ever since, I see your books all over Germany at every airport. They've turned into bestsellers. So I was very curious if we could maybe tonight talk a little bit more about your trajectory in literature, because you started very early actually with a poetry book, and you talk about zones and say that there was a danger of it being hermetic. So little by little you opened up, and I was curious. I mean, we spoke earlier tonight about that, thing Rob Grier told me about Godard and him, and this idea about John Bow, who is here, always talked about Maya, the most advanced yet acceptable.
Right.
So you left this idea of a very hermetic poetry, and now have bestsellers at German airports. Can you tell me how this trajectory somehow happened?
Well, the bestseller at German airports is actually a collaborative project with a dear friend, Ilya Troyanov, the Bulgarian-German novelist. And as you know, this is a book called Kampfabsage, which addresses the fact that all culture is deeply mixed, hybrid, confluential, and sort of returns really to every possible example of a civilization that we can find, and to demonstrate that its strengths actually lie in the fact that it does not have an essence. The whole point of civilization is that it's always, so to speak, a marvelous kuddelmuddel of energies. But to return to your question about the literary trajectory, I think I began with a very, in retrospect, bizarre commitment to producing poems that were really artifacts in some sense, that were closed in on themselves. And gradually it came to me that there was something that went very much against the grain of the medium. I mean, I've always thought of the work of the poet as being not so different from the work of a sculptor or a person who makes montages. Language is a medium, and I say this because I'm an Anglophone poet in this country of many languages, where there's a great deal of pressure on people who write in English, suggesting that this is somehow alien. And we have a history of people using English for all kinds of reasons for 2.5 centuries. And yet there is this pressure. So if you write poetry in English, you have to first put in position a whole series of ideological defenses for your activity. And I find that deeply tedious. So really, I've been much more interested in this idea of using language as some kind of medium that can be sculpted or rendered more fluid. So in the beginning, it was the strategy of creating artifacts. Eventually, the spoken voices and the notion of playing multiple roles has been very important.
And I obviously made a terrible shortcut going from zones directly to the book at the German airport, because there are many, many books in between. And I mean, one of the things which struck me is when I read interviews with you is that there is this whole period of translation. You said that you translated actually Bhattacharya from the Sanskrit, several other important sort of medieval Kashmiri mystic translations occurred, and all of these translations seem to play a big role. You also said that actually reading of Adrian Rich, a poet whom also Homi Bhabha often mentions very often, Jory Graham, James Merrill, was important, and all of that, the translation, the reading, led then to two very different books from Zones, to Cartographer's Apprentice and to Sleepwalker's Archive. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about this transition and the translation, the reading, and then these two books.
Sure. Well, partly this is to do with the fact that I belong in an ethnic sense to this diasporic minority which has moved several times in its history, beginning with Kashmir as a point of departure and then moving out. And the family in any case speaks a multiplicity of languages. So I grew up in this multilingual environment. I mean, I'm fairly monolingual myself, but as a sort of receiving station, I'm tuned to various languages. So, and also because I studied some of these languages, it became important to me to reclaim certain parts of our history, because it seems to me that a productive way of thinking about who we are as people in this particular region is to think about our archival selfhood. And in the nature of all archives, some things are annotated, others are not, some things are lying unlooked at, and some are collapsing. So for me, translation is a way of recovering elements of this archival selfhood. So I started by doing some of Bhartrihari, the Sanskrit poet who had these 300 verses on 3 different subjects. But the Kashmiri project, if you will, has gone on now for 20 years, and Penguin Classics will bring it out later this season. This is Lal Ded. And that was important to me, partly because it meant recovering an ancestral language, partly because it meant addressing the voice of this female mystic poet from the 14th century, which was a time of great transition in Kashmir. And eventually that's led me to reconceive this figure as not a single person, but as a concatenation, if you will, of anonymous authorial presences. So in a sense, what began as an ancestral project and a departure into poetry has ended with my theoretical self again getting some grip on it. But it's been a very happy way of combining the notion of producing a certain poetry in translation along with providing a theoretical account.
And can you tell us a bit more about Sleepwalker's Archive? Because obviously we discussed a lot today the notion of the archive as a very important notion for the 21st century, the protest against forgetting. And memory plays a very essential role in this book. Loss of memory, loss of language.
That to me is a crucial fear. I think the fear of the loss of vision and the fear of the loss of memory and the fear of the loss of language are connected in my mind as highly catastrophic, as of course they would be in any case. But they seem also to me to be metaphorical of what happens or what could happen in any sort of critical predicament for a larger formation. And I've been endlessly fascinated by, possibly because I'm insomniac, I'm greatly fascinated by sleep and the revelations that happen when you're asleep. So the idea of the sleepwalker for me is a very potent kind of figure. Someone who is operating slightly on autopilot, but still working with minefields of possibility. And somehow that figure is mapped in my mind on the Grenzgänger, notion of someone who can cross borders and do so in a way that is fluid, whilst accepting all the ethical responsibilities of crossing a border. There is still that notion that one makes oneself essentially by crossing borders. And then the archive has always been fascinating for me. I guess also from a great fantasy of collection. You know, I've always been fascinated by the idea of collecting endless sets of objects. So these are some of the drives, the sort of the substructure of this book has to do with these linked factors.
Now, about 3 weeks ago on New Year's Eve, I discovered another identity of your many, many identities, and that's your identity as a novelist, which seems to become increasingly important. I met the great publisher and wonderful poet Michael Krüger of Hansa, who is now one of the leading publishing houses in Europe, who is now your German publisher. And I said, what is his sort of most interesting discoveries, what is exciting in literature, as I'm always very curious what's happening in literature, reaching out in literature. And he talked about the extraordinary novelist and poet in India, Ranjit. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your novels, because I also read in an interview that you said that actually a fiction text is not completely impossible. So
What is that, sorry?
no, I read in an interview you gave that actually a fiction text is not completely impossible. A novel set in late Mughal times is an idea that has been with me for a long while. Can you tell us about your novel?
This must come under your famous rubric of unrealized projects. because I've been fascinated by the figure of Dara Shikoh, and this owes, again, everything begins in conversation. Friend and colleague Shuddha, who's here, Shuddha Brata Sengupta, who long ago suggested to me that I should maybe do a verse play on the life of Dara. There's no verse play and there's no novel either as yet, and Mikhail is very kind, but he's where we intersect, of course, is because he's been very, very supportive of my poetry, and he's published this book of poems. But the novel is something that's dangling. It's still something that needs to be researched and thought through. But the reason it continues to fascinate me is because, again, it's a means of recovering from our contested and vexed history. This figure of an imperial scholar who actually stood for a liberal latitude of thought, and who actually has been eclipsed in memory by his brother, who of course gets a lot of bad press, Aurangzeb, who was one of the last great Mughal emperors and was, by all accounts, rather bigoted and responsible for, if you will, the closing of the late medieval, early modern Indian mind.
And now maybe we should switch to curating. We have a few minutes left, and your identity as a curator is of course of great interest to me. We had Rita Kapoor today giving us a wonderful account really of a situation where there was no curating. Until the 90s the word wasn't used in India, and she told us about her pioneering shows. You also started very early in your life to curate in 1994 with Hinged by Light, and have curated regularly ever since. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about curating in the Indian context. When you started to curate, it was at the very beginning also that this notion was used. Who were your influences? I mean, internationally, but I suppose also here. It would be interesting to know if there are pioneers in terms of Indian curating who inspired you, and if you could tell us a little bit the trajectory from Hinged by Light, and maybe last but not least tell us more about Venice and what you're going to do in Venice.
Oh my goodness. How did the curating begin? I think in two simple, specific desires. One was to bear witness to certain forms of art making in Bombay. I mean, this great metropolis that we've heard so much about today. It was a scene where different kinds of artistic choices were being staged. But at a certain point in the 90s, it seemed that the momentum of art history, if you will, was going ahead in a way that did not have place for some of these. When I look back, many of these debates seem to be either trivial or that they were monumentalized out of all shape. But at that point, they were very important and vital to us in terms of the notion that the contemporary was a thing to be achieved in some way, and that other choices, which at least to me seemed to be part of this emerging regional contemporaneity, were not going to be borne witness to. So the first few projects had to do with really working with and presenting the work of friends of different tendency. So on the one hand, there was a fairly classical way of looking at abstractionists who were expanding their field. And on the other, there was, why do I have the feeling that there's something wonderful going on behind me? This is one of those. I suppose that happens to curators eventually. And see what's going on behind you. And the other set of interests was in the work of friends and colleagues who were concerned with the ludic as a way of dealing with history.
Yeah.
Sudarshan is one of them. Anandjit Rai, Ravinder Reddy. So these were actually the first 2 or 3 projects. So to look at these themes or concerns that didn't seem to have much in common, but which for me represented different directions. So for me, the curatorial imagination is like a starfish. I mean, that's the model I've always had, that you can actually move out in different directions, and that what is called for is maybe complexity that opens out in different directions and not something that recurses or repeats itself to necessarily confirm a position that's already in hand.
And if we go from this idea of the starfish, where will Venice go? Can you tell us about your project? I hear about you curating this show in Venice.
That's right. What I would like to do is to use this, I mean, since this is going to be at the heart of the Arsenale, and it is the first time we have this National Pavilion, it would be a good moment to reflect on how exactly these notions of belonging to a nation can be opened up, not through resort to necessarily ideological modes, which we've all done a great deal of in Indian intellectual life, but to see if I could develop portraits of practices that simply transgress the lines between societies, economies of production, and regionalities, if you will. So the 4 artists and artist groups that I've chosen somehow tend to reflect that. On the one hand, it's a kind of way of conceiving of Indian art through various generations and choices and locations. But it could also be a way of having these collide. So if it's Zarina Hashmi, who belongs to a certain generation and position and a particular history of migration, there's also the Desire Machine Collective, who are based in the northeast of India. That's 2 of the 4 artists. But I talk about these because they also help us to dramatize the different fragments that go into the production of this national space. So in some sense, however, I prefer the low-key generally, but I think that there are ways of developing insurrections in a low-key way. So this is what I'm trying to get a sense of.
Great, thank you so very, very much, Ranjit. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Hans.
Great to see you. Thanks so much.